The hem dragged. She couldn't keep it from catching under her shoes. They had stuffed the front with lace and padding to fill the shape of a woman, but she wasn't one, not yet, just 11. The mirror lied as best it could, casting her in the blur of candlelight, softening the angles of her ribs, stretching her neck with shadows, adding the illusion of grace where there was only effort. She stood still because they told her to. She didn't blink. She didn't fidget. She only swallowed, hard and dry, like her throat was coated in dust. The room smelled of starch and rose water and the faint sour breath of old velvet gowns. Outside, the city coughed, soot rising from chimneys, horse hooves on cobblestone, beggars coughing in alleyways. But inside the parlour it was quiet, except for the pins. The governess held them in her lips like sewing needles, pulling the waist tighter, tighter, until the girl's breath came short. "That's better," the woman said, stepping back. "Now you look like a bride." The child looked at herself in the mirror again, but she didn't see a bride. She saw a child dressing for a funeral, because that's what this was, a slow kind of burial, not of her body, but of her girlhood. She didn't understand all of it yet, but she understood enough. She knew her parents were proud, knew the man waiting in the next room was 32, knew that his boots shined so hard you could see your face in them, knew that he brought chocolate and silk when he visited, knew that he kissed her hand like she was porcelain and said things like, "A pretty little thing like you will grow up fine." She knew he owned a mill in Manchester, that he had 5 workers die last winter, that he had no children, that he had no wife, that he had money. She knew what that meant. In Victorian England, marriage was not a matter of love. It was a transaction. And girls like her, pretty, quiet, modest, were currency. The vicar smiled with yellowed teeth. He joked that she'd make a lovely wife by spring. The housekeeper nodded and said nothing. The maid who had brushed the child's hair that morning wept in the hallway and told no one why. Because everyone knew, and no one said. That was how it worked. It was legal. It was expected. The marriage age for girls in England was 12, but consent was a word written in law books, not spoken in parlours. She would be married before her next birthday, perhaps even before the snow melted. Her mother said they were lucky, that many girls were sent off younger, that she'd have servants, that she'd never want for dresses or books or shoes. But the girl did not want shoes. She wanted to run barefoot in the orchard and smear jam on her dress without being scolded. She wanted to stay a child. But the wedding dress was too big, and the house was too quiet, and the candles flickered like they knew something was wrong. Later that night, when the man came in to speak to her alone, he brought sugared almonds. He sat beside her on the chaise and called her pet. He asked her if she liked puppies, if she wanted her own, if she liked to be held. She nodded because that's what she'd been taught to do, to nod, to smile, to sit still, to be pleasing. She didn't understand the way he looked at her knees. She didn't understand why he touched her hair like that. She only knew that something inside her wanted to run, and that something else, a deeper, colder thing, told her to sit still. Because this was how life worked for girls like her. They didn't make choices. They were chosen. In the morning she would be measured again. The bodice would be tightened. The veil was prepared. The date was set. The man would send for a painter to capture her likeness before she changed too much, before she grew, before the marks of womanhood gave away the lie that she was old enough to be a wife, because this marriage was not meant to be a beginning. It was meant to be a containment, a locking away of something that should have bloomed slowly, safely, but was instead being offered like meat on a silver tray. And somewhere inside that little girl, something broke, not loud, not screaming, just a crack, the kind that doesn't heal, the kind that spreads. She sat on the edge of the bed because no one told her where else to go. The room was warm, too warm, thick with the smell of beeswax and old perfume. The curtains were drawn, the candles flickered in polished holders that threw her shadow tall, and stretched against the wall. Her legs swung. Her feet didn't reach the carpet. 12 years old. The dress had been peeled away and folded. She wore linen now, thinner than she expected. It itched. Her hair was loose. The maid had left it down, because men prefer it that way. She hadn't asked what that meant. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn, just sat there, knees pressed tight, hands folded into each other like someone might pray. He walked in slowly, like this was routine, like it didn't matter that she was half his height, like this wasn't a crime, but a right. Because it was. Victorian law said nothing was wrong here. The marriage had been performed, witnessed, signed. She was his wife. And a wife in this world was a contract of flesh, not a partner, a possession. He touched her shoulder gently like he was afraid she'd break. She wanted to. She hoped that if she shattered, it might stop whatever was about to happen. He whispered something low, something about beauty, about duty, about how tonight we become one. She didn't speak, not because she agreed, because she didn't know how to say no. She was 12. She still forgot which fork to use at dinner. She still cried when thunder cracked the windows. She still believed the dolls she left behind at home might miss her. And now she was here, married. The words sounded sharp in her head. Not sweet, not lovely, sharp. He took her hands. They looked like children's hands. He kissed her cheek. She didn't move. When he leaned closer, she smelled wine, tobacco, something earthy and unfamiliar. Then he lifted her nightdress. She flinched. His voice softened. It's all right. This is what husbands and wives do. But it wasn't all right. Her body wasn't ready. Her mind couldn't follow. Her heart beat so fast it hurt. He didn't stop. Not when she turned her face. Not when she went stiff. Not when she whimpered into her shoulder because she didn't know where else to put the sound. He was careful. That's what they would have said. Careful not to bruise. Careful not to leave marks that anyone might question. But she bled anyway. And when he finally stood up and poured himself another drink, he said, "You'll get used to it. They all do." She stared at the ceiling. The plaster had a crack that looked like a branch. Her legs ached. Her skin burned. The candle beside her flickered once and then stilled. It was done. Her virginity was gone. Not given, taken. Like the ribbon in her hair. Like the name she'd signed on the register. And the law would call it legal. The priest would call it holy. The neighbours would call it proper. The world would say she was a wife now. But what she felt was something else entirely. Unmade. The mornings came early now. Not with laughter. Not with sunlight. But with lists. She learned to rise before the sun, lace her bodice without help, and light the hearth before the hall grew cold. The cook expected the fire to be ready by 6, the linen to be soaked, the floors to be swept, the butter churned. She was 12, and she moved through the house like someone twice her age, bent, quiet, busy, always busy. The servants no longer looked at her with sympathy, only with expectation. They had seen girls like her before, new wives with small hands and large eyes, trying to stretch themselves into something respectable. When guests came, she poured the tea. She made curtsies that reached the floor. She smiled when introduced as the lady of the house. Her fingers trembled only once, when a neighbour asked about children, and the room fell still. She folded napkins with practised grace. She practised her penmanship late at night by candlelight. She copied lines from her husband's books, obedience, humility, discretion. The words clung to the page like commandments. She tried to speak like a wife. She had no model, only imitation. Her voice deepened when she greeted guests. She practised saying "yes, my dear" in the mirror. The sound of it scraped against her throat. Once she laughed at something. Not because it was funny, because she thought she was supposed to. Her husband corrected her afterward. "You mustn't laugh like a child," he said, his voice soft but final. "You're a woman now. Don't forget it." She didn't. Her body began to change, breasts too tender beneath corset bones, hips aching. Blood on her underclothes made her think something was wrong, until the maid explained it with a smile. "Good," she said. "You'll be ripe now. He'll be pleased." She didn't know what that meant. She didn't want to know. The other wives in the neighbourhood praised her. "So modest," one said. "So quiet," said another. "You're lucky," they all agreed. "You were chosen." As if being picked made her special, as if being owned made her safe. She nodded each time because that was expected. But the word lucky sounded wrong in her mouth, like a sour fruit. No one asked if she was happy. That wasn't the point. Happiness was not a woman's concern. She was told this once by a cousin, an older wife who had already buried 2 children and stitched her own miscarriages into the lining of her apron. "You want happiness," she said. "Find it in silence, in stillness, in survival." So she did. She stopped laughing. She stopped asking. She folded herself into the wallpaper, present, but unnoticed. The house grew used to her. Her husband praised her manners. The staff praised her quiet. Her mother wrote to say she was proud, and all the while she wondered if there would ever be a moment where she could unclench her jaw, where her breath wouldn't catch just from hearing footsteps outside her door. She still had a doll hidden in a drawer. Its dress was torn, its arm cracked, but she couldn't throw it away. Some nights she held it tight beneath the covers and imagined she was somewhere else, back in her own room, before the veil, before the ink on the marriage certificate, before the wedding night, before she became someone she didn't recognize. She looked in the mirror one morning and tried to find the girl she'd been. But all she saw was someone trying very hard to disappear inside the shape of a woman, and succeeding. It started with nausea. At first she thought it was the meat, or the heat, or the early mornings, but it didn't stop. It came in waves, the kind that left her dizzy, pale, aching behind the eyes. Then the changes, the tightness in her chest, the heaviness in her stomach. She was barely 13. The maid noticed first. She brought her tea laced with herbs and wouldn't say why. She told her to lie down more, to rest. But the resting made her feel worse, like her body was betraying her while she slept. She asked her husband if she was ill. He smiled. "No, my dear," he said, resting a hand on her belly. "You're blooming." It wasn't blooming. It was swelling. It was a small girl trying to carry something she couldn't even name. The doctor came. He didn't speak to her, only to her husband. The child watched from the bed as they discussed her like she was a houseplant. Her womb, her readiness, her constitution. Words floated above her like dust in sunlight. Pretty, meaningless, inescapable. By the time her belly showed, the neighbours began to congratulate her. "Such a good wife," they said. "So soon. What a blessing." "You must be proud," she nodded. Because what else could she do? But she wasn't proud. She was terrified. The midwife arrived in the 8th month. A large woman with cold fingers and a voice like stone. She poked, pressed, prodded, then gave instructions. "Eat this. Avoid that. Don't strain. Too late." The baby came early. It started in the middle of the night. A wetness she couldn't stop. Then the pain. Deep. Twisting. Endless. She screamed. She called for someone. The maid came. The midwife was summoned. Water boiled. Towels soaked. No one told her what to do. Just push. She tried. She tried so hard her vision blackened. She bit her lip until it split. She clawed at the sheets. The bed frame shook. Her screams tore through the house. Her husband didn't come. They said it was normal. They said it always hurt the first time. But this wasn't normal. This was a child tearing herself in half to bring forth something the world had decided she was ready for. She passed out once, maybe twice. When she woke, the crying had already started. A small sound, thin, uncertain. She turned her head slowly. The midwife was wrapping the child, her child, in a cloth. Red stained the linens. The girl's nightgown stuck to her thighs. No one told her if the baby was healthy. No one placed it in her arms. She was left to lie there, shaking, blooded, staring at the ceiling. They said she'd done well, that she was strong, that many girls her age didn't survive the first. She didn't feel strong. She felt hollow. Days passed, maybe more. The baby was brought to her once. She held it, unsure where to put her hands. It was too small, so soft. Its mouth opened and closed like it was searching. She was 13. The baby weighed more than anything she'd ever held. She tried to feed it. It cried. She tried to sing. She didn't know any songs. She stared at it and wondered if it knew, if it could sense that the arms cradling it still trembled from being broken open. No one asked her how she felt. They asked if the baby was fed. They asked if she'd bled too much. They asked if she was ready to try again soon. She wasn't. But readiness was no longer a question. It was a requirement. And somewhere deep inside her, past the pain, past the fear, past the aching breasts and the tender womb, and the weight in her arms, she felt something harden, a resolve, a silence, a shape she would now grow into whether she wanted it or not. The girl was gone, and in her place stood a child, still small, still learning to count, but now, impossibly, holding life itself. The neighbours smiled when they saw her. They didn't see the limp in her step or the way she winced when she sat. They saw her cradle the baby with both arms, nod politely, and wear muted colours. They called it grace. They whispered, "What a devoted little wife she's become." She was 13, maybe 14 now. She didn't mark the seasons by age anymore, only by the number of times she'd bled or hadn't. There was no time for birthdays. There was laundry to boil, floors to scrub, rice water for the baby's rash. Her husband had changed jobs and expected hot tea when he came home. She knew how to fold napkins into swans, how to bake pies with exact crust edges, how to stitch curtains without wasting thread. She'd learned that if you kept moving, the ache didn't spread as much. At church, women called her an angel. They loved her silence. Her husband accepted the praise like it was his own. Sometimes, after service, he would place a hand on her lower back, light, possessive, and say things like, "She's never given me a day of trouble." She smiled on cue, because that's what made them proud. Not cleverness, not strength, not joy, obedience. One afternoon, while shopping for fabric, an older woman pulled her aside. She whispered low behind a bolt of linen, "Keep your mouth shut. Keep your knees closed, and keep your tears for the night." Then she smiled, called her sweetheart, and walked away. She stood still for a long time. In the window beside her was a mannequin draped in wedding lace, smaller than it should have been. She wondered how many girls it had dressed, and how many had bled into it quietly. There were other wives in the neighbourhood, some younger, some older. One had disappeared the year before. Gone to the country, they said. But her house had been emptied in the night. No carriage, no goodbye. Another stopped speaking entirely after her third child died. She swept the street every morning muttering nursery rhymes under her breath. A third, barely 16, was buried after what they called a long illness. The priest said she'd been brave, but the midwife said she'd torn in places no one could stitch. They all had stories told in sighs and sideways glances, but no one said the words out loud. Not a bride, not a child, not broken, just blessed, just faithful, just proper. She learned to perform devotion. She sang lullabies she didn't believe. She wrote thank you notes in a hand she could barely control. She dipped clothes in warm milk to soothe the baby's gums and told herself this was what womanhood meant. Not a choice, but endurance. And still, sometimes, in the smallest of cracks, something slipped out. A glance too long, a tremor in her voice, a moment where she looked out the window and forgot what she was doing. One evening, while folding laundry, her husband came home late. He kissed her forehead and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." And for one split second, she thought of saying it, of answering, "I don't know what I'd do without me either," but she didn't. She smiled, nodded, went back to folding the sheets. The baby cried from the other room. Her body moved before her mind did. That's how it worked now. Action before thought, smile before feeling, silence before truth. The neighbours called it devotion, but she knew better. It wasn't love. It was survival. The preacher said it was sacred. The ceremony, the covenant, the giving of the girl. He stood at the pulpit with his heavy book and heavier voice, and he spoke of obedience as virtue, of suffering as grace. He spoke of wives as treasures, as vessels, as proof of God's favour. She had been one of them, a child handed over with trembling hands, told that her duty was divine, that her silence would be rewarded, that her pain would be transformed into piety if she bore it with enough humility. She tried to believe it. But what church called holy, her body called harm. There was no sanctuary in that house, no refuge in the liturgy, just repetition, of touch, of pregnancy, of bruises that didn't show. The law called it marriage. That's all it needed. The Offences Against the Person Act did not protect wives. Marital rape was not a crime. Neither was beating, so long as the rod was not thicker than a thumb. A husband could discipline. That was his right. The courts would not intervene. She read those words once, or tried to. The pamphlet had been tucked into a drawer behind old bills. She couldn't understand all the legal terms, but she understood the message. What happens to you in private is not the public's concern. The priest said the same, but with gentler words. He told her to pray harder. That submission would bring peace, that a good wife endures. When she asked about pain, he asked if she had provoked it. When she asked about fear, he reminded her that fear of the Lord was the beginning of wisdom. When she said nothing, finally fully, he nodded. Good girl. Silence was proof of devotion. So she learned to keep her voice locked behind her teeth, even when it bled, even when her ribs ached for days, even when she found herself staring at the edge of the wash basin and wondering how long it would take to stop breathing underwater. The neighbours said nothing. They smiled at her on market day, called her a pillar, asked about the baby, complimented her basket weaving. The magistrate passed her once in the street, tipped his hat. He had seen the bruise on her wrist, said nothing. The governess who'd helped prepare her for marriage wrote a letter once congratulating her on her second child. Said she always knew she'd take well to family life. She read it slowly, the words blurring as the candle flickered. Take well. As if suffering was something one could master. As if endurance was elegance. She folded the letter neatly, placed it into the fire and watched the flames rise quietly. Even the midwife, who had seen her torn, swollen, fevered, said she was doing better than most. That line repeated in her head for weeks. Better than most. It meant alive, not safe, not well, just alive. She was the good outcome. She wore gloves to church now, even in summer. She walked slower. She held her daughter's hand too tightly at times, but she never raised her voice, never told the child what her own wedding had felt like. There were some things a mother did not speak, not because she forgot, but because the world had already decided that memory was not hers to own. She held the envelope in both hands. It had come from her husband's solicitor, fine cream paper sealed in wax. Her name was written across the front in cursive script. Elegant, slanted, cold. She stared at it for a long time. She didn't recognize the letters. Not really. She knew the name was hers. She'd seen it before, on the marriage license, on the birth certificates of her children. She could write it, more or less. Had been taught to trace each loop, each line, each perfect curl. But knowing the shape of a name wasn't the same as owning it. She could not read it aloud with confidence, because the girl never finished school. She left at 11. The lesson stopped when the wedding planning began. The spelling drills were replaced by sewing patterns. Latin was traded for napkin folding. She had practiced her husband's name more than her own, because that was what mattered. When she signed documents, she copied what others wrote first. She mimicked, she obeyed. But the letters on this envelope stared back like strangers. They knew more about her than she did. Inside, the paper rustled. Another form to sign. Something about inheritance, or land, or debts. She wasn't told the details. He said, "Just put your name at the bottom." So she did. It was the only thing she still knew how to give. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, she wondered if there was a version of her that could have done more. Read novels by firelight, written poems, taught her daughters Latin, not just prayer. Sometimes she looked at ink and thought about all the words she might have said if anyone had ever asked her what she wanted. But no one had. No one ever would. And so, she stared at the envelope, at the script that spelled a name she couldn't fully claim, and she felt something colder than grief. She felt absent, not just of education, but of identity. Because in this world, girls like her weren't taught to write history, only to survive it. She lived to be 47. That's what the record said. A wife, a mother of 4, died of fever in the early spring. The obituary was short, 2 sentences. It listed her husband's name, his profession, his grief. Her name came second. It always had. Neighbours said she was quiet, dignified, that she kept a good house and raised obedient children, that she never caused a scene, never complained, never left. They called it a happy ending, because she hadn't died in childbirth, because her husband didn't leave her, because the house never burned down, and the children made it to adulthood, because surviving was enough to be considered blessed. No one asked what she had survived. They didn't ask how many nights she slept facing the wall, curled around her emptiness. They didn't ask about the fevers that came without warning, or the teeth she lost before 30, or the bruises that never reached daylight. They didn't ask what it meant to carry silence for so many years that your voice forgets how to rise. She was a child bride, then a mother, then a widow, and then just gone, buried beneath a plain headstone with her married name carved clean across the front. No mention of the girl she was before the dress, before the contract, before the ribbons and blood and trembling hands that had once reached for a doll, then a husband, then nothing at all. Her daughters wore black. They didn't cry at the service. They had been taught not to. Her youngest placed a single violet on the coffin lid, then stepped back. No one spoke of her story, because stories require a listener, and the world had already turned the page.